He carried their gear into the spotlight but lived his entire life in its shadow. He was Mal Evans, the gentle giant who served as the Beatles' protector on the road and their secret weapon in the studio. But the final act of his life wasn't immortalized on a gold record. It was detailed in a police report. His story doesn't end with the sound of applause, but with the sudden violence of a tragic mistake, a hail of bullets that took his life at just 40 years old. This is the tale of how a man at the heart of the world's greatest dream found himself in a forgotten, violent nightmare. It's a story of absolute loyalty and the terrifying price paid by the one who gave everything, only to be left with nothing when the dream was over. To understand the man who would pay such a terrifying price, we must go back to the very beginning, to the world that shaped him long before the dream ever started. Malcolm Evans was born on May 27, 1935, in Liverpool, England. It was a tough, working-class port city, a world that valued stoic resilience and steady work over artistic ambition. This environment, shaped by industry and a culture of dependability, profoundly influenced his early life. His father, Frederick, a railwayman, embodied the values of industrial Britain: reliability, hard work, and a life measured by duty. From a young age, Mal was raised in a culture where a man's worth was defined by his ability to provide, leaving little room for artistic dreams. His physical presence seemed to confirm this destiny. He was an imposing figure, standing nearly 6'6" with a powerful build. Yet this imposing stature housed a remarkably kind and gentle soul, earning him the lifelong nickname, the Gentle Giant. This contradiction was both a gift, making him a natural protector, and a burden. He was a soft-spoken, good-natured man, but the world saw a mountain, a misunderstanding that would one day have fatal consequences. Following a common path for young men of his time, Mal secured a position as a telephone engineer for the General Post Office. In post-war Britain, this was a respectable career for life, offering stability and a pension. Daily, he worked on the very communication lines that would soon carry news of the band destined to change his life forever. For Mal, music was a private hobby. Though he had a fondness for the banjo, he, like many of his generation, was captivated by the electrifying sounds of American rock and roll filtering across the Atlantic. He loved Elvis Presley and Gene Vincent, but the idea of pursuing music as a career was an unimaginable fantasy. His life was set on a predictable foundation. In 1961, he married a young local woman named Lily, and they settled into a modest, respectable life in the Allerton suburb of Liverpool. They had 2 children, a son, Gary, and a daughter, Julie. By all measures, Mal Evans was on a path to a stable, conventional life as a devoted husband, father, and reliable employee. But destiny, it turned out, had other plans, and it was waiting for him in the dark, damp, deafeningly loud basement of a club on Matthew Street called the Cavern, the single decisive pivot point of Mal Evans' entire existence. Came not with a bang, but with the mundane need to earn a little extra money. In late 1961, to supplement his modest income from the post office and provide a bit more for his growing family, he took on a side job. He became a doorman, or more accurately, a bouncer, at the Cavern Club. At the time, the Cavern was the pulsating, sweat-soaked epicenter of Liverpool's burgeoning music scene, a subculture bubbling with raw energy and ambition. And the undisputed, unrivaled kings of that club were a raw, charismatic, and relentlessly energetic local band called the Beatles. For Mal, at first, it was just a job. His role was simple: stand by the door, look imposing, and keep the peace among the throngs of teenagers who packed themselves into the sweaty, vaulted brick cellars. The air was thick with the smell of cigarettes, cheap perfume, and damp brickwork. Condensation dripped from the arches onto the tightly packed crowds. The volume was punishing. But from his post by the door, Mal had a front row seat to a cultural explosion in its infancy. Night after night he watched them. John Lennon, the sharp-tongued, witty leader, Paul McCartney, the impossibly charming and melodic one, George Harrison, the quiet, intense younger brother, and their then drummer Pete Best, the handsome, brooding powerhouse. He saw more than just a band playing cover songs. He saw their ferocious energy, their undeniable magnetic chemistry, and the frantic, almost hysterical devotion they inspired in their young fans. He saw the way they fed off the crowd's energy, their leather-clad figures drenched in sweat under the hot lights, driving the beat harder and faster. He quickly went from being an employee of the club to being a genuine, devoted Rain. The music, a powerful cocktail of American R&B, rock and roll, and their own nascent original songs, was everything he loved, played with a passion and a fury he had never witnessed before. During their breaks, he would strike up conversations with them. His unassuming, friendly, and utterly non-threatening nature made an immediate impression. In a world of hangers-on and would-be managers, Mal wanted nothing from them. He was just a friendly giant who loved their music. It was George Harrison, the youngest and perhaps most observant Beatle, who first truly befriended him. George, often quiet and introspective, seemed to recognize a kindred spirit in the soft-spoken doorman. He saw in Mal a trustworthy and calming presence, a solid, dependable figure in the chaotic energy that was beginning to swirl around them. They would chat about music, about guitars, about the simple everyday things that were rapidly becoming a luxury for the band. A bond of trust was being formed, a quiet friendship that would soon change Mal's life forever. As the Beatles' local fame began to skyrocket under the astute guidance of their new manager Brian Epstein, their needs grew exponentially. They were no longer just a club band playing for pocket money. They were a professional outfit on the cusp of national stardom. Their schedule was becoming relentless, a dizzying whirlwind of club dates, ballroom gigs, and radio appearances. They needed more than just a manager. They needed a team, a small, tightly knit group of people they could trust implicitly, people who would be loyal not to the phenomenon, but to them as individuals. In August of 1963, with the band's first album already a massive hit, and their second on the way, the machine was in overdrive. On the quiet recommendation of George Harrison, Brian Epstein approached Mal Evans and officially offered him a job. It was an offer that defied all logic. He was asked to trade a guaranteed life pension for a backstage pass. To his family and friends, it wasn't just a risk. It was a form of respectable suicide. But for Mal, it was the call of destiny he didn't even know he was waiting for. He accepted. He walked away from the GPO, from the pension, from the predictable future, and stepped into the unknown. He joined their other trusted friend from the early days, Neil Aspinall, as one half of the Beatles' entire road crew. His official title was road manager, or more simply roadie, but his role would quickly become something far more profound, far more personal, and far more all-consuming than any job description could ever capture. In the beginning, his duties were straightforward, a blend of technical know-how and brute force. He was the muscle and the mechanic. He drove the van, a tiny Austin packed to the gills with the band, their equipment, their ambitions, and the lingering smell of cigarette smoke and lukewarm tea. He was the one who lugged the heavy Vox amplifiers and Ludwig drum kits up the rickety staircases of provincial cinemas and down into the cellars of smoky jazz clubs. His background as an engineer, once used to fix telephone lines, now made him invaluable in a different way. He could fix a faulty amp with a deft touch, solder a broken guitar wire moments before showtime, and set up the entire stage with a practiced, unhurried efficiency that calmed the pre-show nerves of the band. He was in essence the man who made the shows happen. Anecdotes from this early pre-fame period paint a picture of a man with a limitless, almost superhuman capacity for dedication. He would drive the band through the night in treacherous winter weather to make a gig in a distant Scottish town, running on little more than caffeine, nicotine, and sheer willpower. He served as their unofficial bodyguard, a role for which he was physically perfect, but temperamentally unsuited. He rarely, if ever, had to use force. The sheer sight of him, a mountain of a man with a kind face, standing quietly by the stage door, was a gentle but remarkably effective deterrent to any overzealous fans or potential troublemakers. But this role also began to cement a dangerous public perception. To the world, he wasn't Mal the friend, he was Mal the muscle, the enforcer, a perception he handled with kindness, but an image he could never fully escape. He was the ultimate fixer. When Paul's treasured Hufner bass needed a new string, Mal found one. When John broke a guitar strap mid-set, Mal was there with a spare. When a promoter tried to shortchange them on their fee, Mal would quietly but firmly stand his ground until the matter was settled. He was a constant, reassuring presence. He was no longer just an employee. He was rapidly becoming an essential cog in the machine, the quiet, steady anchor in the nascent storm of what the world would soon call Beatlemania. The telephone engineer from Allerton was gone, replaced by a man whose entire existence was now dedicated to ensuring that when the lights went up, the Beatles were ready to play. The biggest adventure in the world was about to begin, and he had a front row seat. The decision to abandon a life of predictable security for one of chaotic uncertainty was a seismic shift for Mal Evans, but it was merely a tremor compared to the earthquake to come. The latter half of 1963 was a relentless boot camp in the realities of the music business, a blur of motorways, drafty dressing rooms, and the ever-present, ever-growing sound of screaming fans. Mal, alongside Neil Aspinall, formed the entire operational infrastructure of a phenomenon that was rapidly outgrowing its container. They were the architects of every show, the fixers of every problem, the silent, steady hands that allowed the magic to happen night after night. But everything they had experienced, the packed ballrooms, the frantic car chases from theaters, the burgeoning press attention, was merely a dress rehearsal for the main event. What had been a British phenomenon was about to go global, and Mal Evans was about to be swept from the eye of a local storm into the heart of a global hurricane. On February 7, 1964, as Pan Am Flight 101 headed for America, the anxiety was immense. While the Beatles privately feared they wouldn't live up to the homeland of their rock and roll heroes, Mal Evans's anxiety was of a more practical, yet equally intense nature. His world was one of logistics, of tangible objects that had to be in the right place at the right time. He was responsible for the tools of their trade, Paul's iconic Hufner bass, John and George's Gretsch and Rickenbacker guitars, and Ringo's precious Ludwig drum kit. He had meticulously overseen the loading of the equipment, and as the plane crossed the Atlantic, his focus was solely on the cargo hold below, where the tools of their trade and the weight of his responsibility were stored. He was the guardian of the sound that was about to either captivate a nation or fail completely. The moment the plane's wheels touched down at John F. Kennedy Airport, any fears of indifference were obliterated. As the cabin door opened, they were hit by a wall of sound, a high-pitched, continuous shriek from thousands of teenagers pressed against the airport fences. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated chaos. Mal's first instinct was pure protector. While the band waved, absorbing the shock, his mind was already on the mission. Get the men and the equipment through the mob and into the waiting vehicles. He navigated the scrum of reporters and police, his sheer size a natural advantage, his focus entirely on the safety of the four young men. This was his first taste of a new reality. His job was no longer just about setting up a stage. It was about navigating a world that had lost its collective mind. That new reality became even more stark within the confines of their suite at the legendary Plaza Hotel. They were prisoners of their own success, held captive in a suite at the Plaza. Below the streets were no longer streets, but a river of pure human sound, a permanent siege of adoration that sounded just like a riot. For Mal, this siege marked the beginning of a new, essential role. He became their sole link to the outside world, their trusted emissary to a city they could only see from their window, solidifying his transformation from a roadie into an indispensable part of their inner circle. His duties became a surreal fusion of the domestic and the divine. He was their sole tether to the real world, the man sent to pierce the bubble of their fame, to retrieve small sacred artifacts of their former lives. A pack of woodbines, a bag of fish and chips, a specific Howlin' Wolf record. He was the gatekeeper at the door of the suite, a friendly but immovable object who filtered the endless stream of reporters, DJs, and hangers-on, allowing in only the chosen few. He was their shield, their provider, their tether to some semblance of normal life in the most abnormal of circumstances. The apex of this American invasion, the moment that burned itself into the consciousness of a generation, was their performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Backstage at the CBS studio, the atmosphere was electric with tension. For Mal, this was the ultimate test of his professional competence. The pressure was immense. 73 million people were about to tune in. A single blown fuse, a single faulty cable could spell disaster. He moved with a deliberate, calming purpose, a giant in motion amidst the frantic energy of the television crew. He set up Ringo's drum kit, carefully positioning the now famous Drop T logo drumhead so the cameras would catch it perfectly. He checked every wire, every connection, plugging in each guitar, and testing the amplifiers himself, his ear trained to detect the slightest hum of imperfection. He was the last person to speak to each of them before they walked out into the glare of the lights, offering a final check and a reassuring nod to signal that everything was ready. As the band launched into All My Loving, Mal stood in the wings, a silent, unseen guardian, watching the four figures he had driven around in a tiny van just months before now command the attention of an entire continent. He saw the raw power of their performance, but he also saw the beads of sweat on their brows, the sheer concentration it took to hold it all together. In that moment, watching from the shadows, he felt an immense surge of protective pride. He wasn't just their roadie, he was a custodian of their dream. And in that studio, that dream had become reality on a scale no one could have ever imagined. The American tour was a triumph, but it established the pattern for the next 2 years of their lives. A relentless, soul-crushing grind lived entirely within a hermetically sealed bubble. Life for Mal Evans became a disorienting blur of airports, hotel rooms, press conferences, and the ceaseless, deafening scream of the crowd. He was with them for every historic moment. He was there when they met Elvis Presley at his home in Bel Air, a surreal summit of rock and roll royalty where Mal found himself in quiet conversation with the legendary Memphis Mafia, sharing stories of life on the road, two sets of loyalists from different generations finding common ground. He was also present for a more private, but equally significant, historical first. In the August of 1964, back in a New York hotel room, Bob Dylan famously introduced the band to marijuana for the very first time. Mal was there in the room, not just as a silent observer, but as a participant, sharing in the experience that would profoundly alter their creative direction and open the doors to a new, more introspective and psychedelic phase of their music. He was no longer just working for them. He was living with them, breathing the same rarefied air, his own identity slowly but surely beginning to merge with theirs. A task that symbolized this merger was his mastery of their signatures. Besieged by endless requests for autographs, the band deputized Mal to sign for them. He studied each signature, John's quick scrawl, Paul's elegant left-handed loop, George's precise script, Ringo's starry sign-off, until he could reproduce them perfectly. His forgeries became so adept that they are still prized by collectors today, often indistinguishable from the real thing. It was a simple, practical solution to an overwhelming problem, but it was also deeply symbolic. His hand was now, for all intents and purposes, their hand. The line between Mal Evans the man and Mal Evans the extension of the Beatles was beginning to blur. This unwavering, all-consuming loyalty was put to its ultimate terrifying test in July of 1966. The Beatles were in the midst of a grueling world tour that was fraying their nerves and testing their sanity. The music had become secondary to the spectacle. At massive stadium shows like their historic concert at Shea Stadium, the sound of the crowd was so overwhelmingly loud that they couldn't even hear themselves play. For Mal, these shows were a logistical nightmare. The tiny Vox amplifiers they used were completely inadequate, their sound swallowed by the cavernous stadiums and the wall of human noise. His job was to ensure the gear worked perfectly, even though it was an exercise in futility. The experience was becoming absurd, a pantomime of a rock and roll show. But the absurdity was about to curdle into genuine terror. The dream became a nightmare in Manila, Philippines. The country was under the authoritarian rule of President Ferdinand Marcos and his wife Imelda, when the band's manager politely declined an invitation to the presidential palace. A catastrophic miscalculation, as an invitation was a command. The state-controlled media whipped up a frenzy of anti-Beatle fury. Overnight, their security vanished, and they were trapped in a hostile city. The extensive security detail that had been assigned to them had vanished. The hotel staff were openly hostile. Threatening phone calls flooded the switchboard. They were trapped, alone, and surrounded by a manufactured but very real wave of nationalistic fury. The journey to the airport was an ordeal of pure terror. They were forced to make their own way, without police protection, through a hostile, menacing mob that had gathered at the hotel and at the airport itself. The adoring screams of fans had been replaced by the guttural roars of a lynch mob. As they tried to navigate the terminal, the chaos erupted into violence. The entire Beatles entourage, the 4 band members, Brian Epstein, Neil Aspinall, and Mal, were kicked, spat on, and assaulted. In that moment of life-threatening panic, Mal Evans stopped being a roadie and became a human shield. His massive frame, which had always been a source of gentle reassurance, was now their only line of defense. He instinctively placed himself between the band and the angriest members of the mob, absorbing punches and kicks meant for John, Paul, George, and Ringo. He formed a living wall, pushing forward, shepherding his friends through the gauntlet, his face a mask of grim determination. He was terrified, but his loyalty and his protective instinct overrode every other emotion. It was the first time Mal had tasted the true terrifying violence that fame attracted, a visceral understanding that his job wasn't just about tuning guitars, but about being willing to put his own body on the line. They escaped by the skin of their teeth, scrambling onto the plain, bruised, shaken, and utterly traumatized. The incident left a deep and permanent scar. It was a terrifying reminder of how quickly the adulation of the crowd could turn to murderous rage, how vulnerable they truly were. For the Beatles, it was the final straw, the definitive event that convinced them to stop touring forever. The risk was no longer worth the reward. But for Mal, it was something more personal, a dark prophecy of sorts. The incident planted a seed of trauma deep in his mind, that the world was a violent, unpredictable place, and that his size, his image as the enforcer, would always place him on the front line. He had stood between his friends and a force he couldn't control, and this time he had walked away. But a quiet, chilling question now lodged itself in his soul. What would happen the next time? The final chord of their last ever concert at Candlestick Park in August 1966 did not ring out with triumphant finality. It was swallowed by the indifferent wind and the ceaseless, distant scream of 25,000 fans who had no idea they were witnessing the end of an era. For the Beatles, the feeling was one of profound, weary relief. The grind was over. The madness of the road, which had culminated in the terrifying ordeal in Manila, was finally behind them. But for Mal Evans, the silence that followed that final show was filled with a daunting, terrifying uncertainty. His entire life, his entire purpose for the past 3 years had been defined by the road. He was the road manager. He was the man who got the show on the road, kept it on the road, and packed it up when it was over. Now, the road had come to a dead end. In the weeks that followed, as the band scattered to pursue individual interests and decompress from the trauma of touring, Mal found himself in a professional limbo. The question loomed large and unspoken. What now? Was he about to be let go, a relic of a chapter that was now firmly closed? His skills were those of a man of action, of logistics, of crisis management in chaotic environments. What use was a road manager to a band that no longer had a road? It was a period of deep anxiety for Mal, a fear that the magical world he had sacrificed everything to enter was about to eject him. But the bond he had forged with the four men went far deeper than a simple employer-employee relationship. He wasn't just a roadie, he was family. And as the Beatles prepared to embark on their next great adventure, a full-scale retreat into the creative sanctuary of the recording studio, they made it implicitly clear that Mal was coming with them. The screams of the stadium were replaced by the hum of a 4-track machine. For Mal, the war was over, but a new, quieter, and more complex mission was about to begin. He was transitioning from the battlefield of Beatlemania to the laboratory of the Beatles. To step into Abbey Road Studio 2 in those days was to enter a sacred space, a laboratory filled with the smell of old equipment and magnetic tape. It was presided over by producer George Martin and his team of engineers in their signature white lab coats. In this world of quiet contemplation and subtle sonic adjustments, Mal Evans, a man of physical action, initially felt like a fish out of water. His role began to truly take shape during the recording sessions for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Freed from the constraints of performing live, the band was venturing into uncharted territory and needed someone to translate their wildest sonic fantasies into reality. Mal became that man, no longer just a protector, but a musical Swiss Army knife. His contributions began with practical tasks, like supplying the constant flow of tea and toast that fueled the late-night sessions. But his involvement quickly deepened as he became a sounding board and a keeper of notes. His meticulous diaries became an unofficial log of the masterpiece's creation. No track better illustrates his integration than A Day in the Life. For the audacious orchestral crescendo bridging John's verses and Paul's middle section, the session was a surreal experience. Mal found himself in a studio with 40 classical musicians in formal wear, while the Beatles handed out party favors. Mal wore a fake nose. His contributions were crucial. He wound the alarm clock that jolts the listener between sections. More significantly, it is Mal's steady voice you hear counting down the orchestra, a non-musician acting as a human metronome for virtuosos. And for the song's legendary final piano chord, Mal was there, one of a select few with his hands on the keys, becoming a physical part of the sound. This became his new normal. If the band needed a peculiar sound, Mal would find or create it. He played a sustained Hammond organ note through all of You Won't See Me, tambourine on Dear Prudence, a trumpet part in Helter Skelter, and famously struck a blacksmith's anvil on Maxwell's silver hammer. He was also a muse and scribe. He was Paul McCartney's first audience while the melody for Hey Jude was being formulated, and it was Mal's handwriting on the original lyric sheets. Being in that room, breathing the same air as genius unfolded, was a high more potent than any narcotic. The validation and shared secrets were an addiction that consumed him, and the closer he got to the sun of his friend's genius, the more his own world fell into shadow. While he was becoming indispensable to the Beatles, his own personal universe was crumbling. The relentless demands of his job meant he was an absent husband and father, leaving his wife Lily to raise their two children, Gary and Julie, almost single-handedly. The contrast was brutal. In early 1968, he was on a spiritual pilgrimage in Rishikesh, India, meditating in the foothills of the Himalayas and witnessing the incredible burst of creativity that would form the White Album. But while he was living this dream, life went on without him. His son celebrated a birthday without his father. The price for his place in music history was his place in his own family's everyday story. His diary entries from this period are a heartbreaking chronicle of a man torn in two, filled with awe for the magic he was witnessing, but also a profound loneliness and guilt for the family he had all but abandoned. His absolute devotion to the Beatles was a force that his marriage tragically could not survive. The beginning of the end came with the launch of their chaotic business venture, Apple Corps, in 1968. Though given an official executive title, Mal's role became frustratingly ill-defined in the corporate free-for-all. A man of action and loyalty, he found himself adrift in a world of balance sheets and business strategy. His unique skills suddenly less valuable in this treacherous new environment. His own diaries from this period reveal a man stretched to his breaking point, riddled with a self-doubt that mirrored the band's own slow-motion dissolution. The recording sessions for the White Album and the subsequent Let It Be project were famously fraught with tension. The four-headed monster was beginning to splinter into four distinct, often conflicting individuals. Mal's role shifted once again. He was no longer just a creative assistant. He was now the reluctant peacekeeper, the emotional ballast in a room thick with unspoken resentment and artistic disagreements. While trying to keep the peace during the tense filming of the Let It Be sessions in January 1969, he wrote in his diary, "Felt as if I had let them down in my role. A big-headed roadie. I'm not a bloody record executive. Had to tell Paul I was leaving, but he said I was needed, so I stayed. I feel a bit down." The words bleed with insecurity and a painful self-awareness. The title of fifth Beatle, once a suit of armor, was beginning to feel like a borrowed costume, 2 sizes too big. He wasn't just watching a family fracture. He was a mirror, and as they splintered apart, he could feel his own reflection begin to crack. Yet his loyalty never wavered. He was there until the very last public moment. On January 30th, 1969, when the band ascended to the cold, wind-swept roof of the Apple Building for their final impromptu public performance, Mal was there. As the glorious, unexpected sound of live Beatles music once again echoed through the streets of London, it was Mal who was tasked with one final crucial job. When police officers, responding to noise complaints, arrived and demanded the concert be shut down, it was Mal Evans, the ultimate protector, who was sent to intercept them. His job was to engage with the officers, a final act of running interference that ultimately delayed the end of the performance. It was a perfect, poignant, and symbolic end to his active role. The gentle giant standing guard, protecting the music from the intrusion of the real world. But the magic was running out for them and for him. The final impromptu concert on the rooftop of Apple headquarters was more than just the Beatles' last public performance. It was a metaphor for their entire situation. They were high above the real world, making a glorious noise, while down below, the forces of order and consequence, in the form of the London police, were slowly but surely closing in. For Mal Evans, his final act of loyal service, stalling those policemen, buying his friends just a few more precious minutes of magic, was also a poignant bookend to his career. He had started as a doorman, a gatekeeper, and he had ended in the same role, a gentle giant standing guard over the music. But when the amplifiers were switched off for the last time and the band descended from the roof, the magic was truly running out and a long, deafening silence was about to begin. The official breakup of the Beatles was not a single clean amputation, but a slow, agonizing process of disintegration that stretched through 1969 and into the spring of 1970. For Mal, it was like watching a beloved family tear itself apart in slow motion. The recording sessions for their final masterpiece, Abbey Road, were often a study in separation, with the four members frequently working in different studios on their own songs. The camaraderie of the Sgt. Pepper era was gone, replaced by a tense professional courtesy that barely masked the deep fissures that had formed. Mal would move between the sessions, a familiar, comforting presence in a fractured environment, but he was powerless to heal the wounds. He witnessed the bitter business meetings with the polarizing new manager, Alan Klein, saw the arguments over money and creative control, and felt the deep, unspoken resentments that were pulling his four friends in different directions. He was a witness to the end of the world he had helped build. The final public blow came on April 10th, 1970, when Paul McCartney officially announced he was leaving the band, effectively confirming the rumors that had been swirling for months. For most fans, it was a moment of collective cultural grief, the end of an era. But for Mal Evans, it was something far more personal, far more existential. It was a sudden, brutal withdrawal. The news didn't just signify the end of his job, it signified the end of his very identity. The purpose that had animated his every waking moment for nearly a decade was gone. The noise, the magic, the camaraderie, the constant sense of being at the center of the universe, it all stopped overnight, replaced by a terrifying void. His entire nervous system had been wired to the rhythm of the band, and now that rhythm had ceased. His diary entry from that day captures the terror of that moment in a few spare, heartbreaking words. April 10th, 1970. The Beatles are finished. What am I, what are we all going to do now? It was the question that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. In that moment, he was no longer the Beatles' fixer, their protector, or their friend. He was just a man, adrift in a cold, empty ocean, with no map, no compass, and no land in sight. The man who had lived the Beatles' legend had absolutely no idea how to begin writing his own. The years immediately following the breakup were a period of desperate, painful searching for Mal. He tried to parlay his unparalleled connections and unique experience into a new career, attempting to find a new mission in a world that no longer had a place for him. Initially, he clung to the familiar orbit of his old friends, contributing to their early solo albums. He was there for the monumental sessions for George Harrison's magnum opus, All Things Must Pass, playing tambourine and offering the same quiet, supportive presence he always had. He was in the studio for John Lennon's raw, primal scream therapy album, John Lennon/Plastic Ono Band, and his more polished follow-up, Imagine. But the dynamic had fundamentally changed. He was a welcome friend, a cherished piece of their shared past, but he was no longer an essential component. The magic had been created by the unique chemistry of the four of them together, and now that chemistry was gone. In these solo sessions, he was a guest in their new lives, no longer a resident of their shared one. It was a subtle but profoundly painful realization. He made a genuine attempt to forge his own path as a record producer and songwriter. He had co-written a song, You and Me, Babe, with George Harrison, which appeared on Ringo Starr's 1973 solo album, Ringo. He did production work for several artists on the Beatles' Apple label, most notably the talented but tragic band Badfinger, and he helped discover and produce the band Splinter for George Harrison's Dark Horse label. But he was not a natural producer in the vein of a George Martin. His genius lay in loyalty and practicality, in an intuitive understanding of the needs of the four men he had served. He was the ultimate facilitator, not the visionary. His efforts, while respectable, failed to provide him with the new, all-consuming purpose he so desperately craved. In a profound attempt to start a new life and perhaps escape the ghosts of his past, he separated from his wife Lily and moved from England to Los Angeles in the early 1970s. He began a new relationship with a woman named Fran Hughes and embarked on the monumental task that he hoped would be his salvation, writing his memoirs. The book, which he tentatively titled Living the Beatles Legend, was meant to be his definitive story, a comprehensive insider's account of his time in the eye of the hurricane. He hoped it would provide him with the financial security and, more importantly, the personal validation he now so desperately needed. It was his chance to step out from the shadows and tell the world who he was. But the project, his last great hope, became a source of immense, crushing pressure. He was surrounded by his old diaries, notebooks, and photographs, a mountain of memories from a life that felt like it had happened to someone else. He struggled to organize the whirlwind of a decade into a coherent narrative. The weight of his own legend, so inextricably tied to the legend of the band he had served, seemed to paralyze him. How could he possibly translate the magic, the chaos, the joy, and the pain onto the sterile white page? The book was supposed to be the first chapter of his new life. Instead, it became the tombstone for his old one, a project that forced him to live as a ghost in the ruins of his own magnificent past. His personal life, which had been adrift for years, now began to spiral downwards into a dark and dangerous place. He fell into a deep, debilitating depression, a profound sense of melancholy and purposelessness that he tried to numb with an increasing reliance on alcohol and sedative drugs. The gentle giant, the man who had been a rock of stability for the four most famous people in the world, was now utterly lost, consumed by a sense of being forgotten. His old friends, the former Beatles, were now absorbed in their own wildly successful solo careers, new families, and new lives. They loved him and they would hear from him in occasionally desperate late-night phone calls. But they were no longer a cohesive unit that could save him. They were scattered across the globe, fighting their own battles. Mal was on his own, a forgotten soldier from a glorious war that everyone else had moved on from. He was haunted by the past, a past so magnificent that it rendered his present invisible. The tragic, violent, and utterly bewildering end came on the night of January 5th, 1976. Mal was at his rented home in a Los Angeles duplex with his girlfriend, Fran Hughes. He had been despondent for days, deeply depressed about the upcoming deadline for his book manuscript, which he felt he could never finish, and about the general state of his life. He was in a state of intense emotional distress, his judgment clouded by alcohol and Valium. He became inconsolable, his gentle nature curdling into a desperate, confused agitation. In this distraught state, he picked up what police later identified as a rifle. Accounts of the weapon vary and remain a point of contention. Some sources report it was a loaded Winchester rifle, while others have described it as a non-lethal air rifle. Regardless, in the dim light of the room, it looked real and menacing enough. It was a desperate, theatrical gesture from a man who had lost all hope. Alarmed and genuinely frightened by his erratic behavior and his refusal to be calmed, Fran Hughes made a desperate decision. She called the police, hoping they could intervene, perhaps get him the medical help he so clearly needed. When 4 officers from the Los Angeles Police Department arrived, the situation escalated into a textbook tragedy of errors in a matter of seconds. They were met by Fran, who frantically explained that her boyfriend was upstairs, distraught, intoxicated, and armed with what she said was a rifle. The police proceeded upstairs and saw Mal through the bedroom doorway, brandishing what they could only perceive to be a high-powered rifle. They ordered him to drop the weapon. What happened in Mal's confused and grief-stricken mind in that final moment is impossible to know. Perhaps he didn't hear them. Perhaps in his state he didn't understand. Perhaps in his ultimate despair he didn't care. Instead of complying, he reportedly pointed the weapon in their direction. The police, believing their lives were in imminent danger, reacted according to their training. They opened fire. A volley of 6 shots was fired. 4 of them struck Mal. Mal Evans, the gentle giant, the man who had protected the Beatles from the madness of the world, was killed instantly. He was just 40 years old. The man who had survived mobs and riots, who had stood as a human shield, died in a hail of bullets, brought down by a fatal misunderstanding of the very image that had defined him his entire life. The world did not see the gentle giant. It saw only the giant. And in a hail of bullets, it shattered the illusion, and the man forever. The aftermath of Mal Evans' death was a series of heartbreaking ironies. His ashes were temporarily lost in the mail, and the full manuscript of his memoir, the project that had caused him such anguish, vanished, leaving his complete story untold. His legacy, therefore, is not written, but lived. He was the ultimate unsung hero, a powerful reminder of the loyal, invisible people behind every great work of art. But his story is also a profound warning about the dangers of losing yourself in someone else's orbit. For Mal, the Beatles' breakup was a psychological death. Having given everything to their dream, he had nothing left to rebuild. Ultimately, Mal Evans should be remembered not for his tragic death, but for the extraordinary devotion that defined his life, an unsung hero who stood between chaos and the music, and whose quiet presence made history possible. His story reminds us to look beyond the bright spotlight and remember those who quietly help others shine, even if it means they are ultimately left alone in the shadows.